Hi there, everybody. Nice to see you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Glad that you're taking time to go through this session, even if you weren't able to join us live, to think a little bit about your professional self and maybe rethinking that a little bit. Um, if we're working together on this, I think it's really beneficial to open up that worksheet that John so nicely put up on the Onward site and also open up the slide deck for yourself. So, if we're thinking about the different types of things that we're going to be doing today, I always start off with a little bit of an icebreaker, whether you're in the session physically or not. So I would invite you to pause the video and take just a few minutes to actually write down an initial response on your worksheet to these questions. Obviously, when you pause, you'll have as much time as you want to answer these questions. So I am going to shift us from this pretty quickly because I hope you take the time you need to delve deeper into the questions, to think a little bit about yourself. I know that most of the folks that I'm working with in these sessions, are folks that have potentially had to kind of shift in many different ways, countries, positions, future careers, lifestyles, all different types of ways. And so part of what I think is important about this session is to think a little bit more about who you are in depth, as opposed to just jumping into this idea of looking for a career. This gives us a little bit of retrospection. So I didn't introduce myself, but I'll take just a second to do that now. I call myself a joy coach. I help people to do lots of different things, but part of what I'm doing in this particular series is helping folks to think about career shifts. And so this is the first in the series, and like I said, we're taking more of an inner look. It's not necessarily a performative session in terms of creating something specific for the market, but I think it's really, really important to take this step. Um, I am a academic veteran. I worked at Cornell University for many years in many different capacities, as a leader, as a lecturer, et cetera, et cetera. So I have a lot of years of experience working with folks and helping them to thrive in higher education, as well as in lots of different job sectors. So that's a little bit about me. Um, so as I mentioned, I think it's really, really beneficial to grab that worksheet. This is kind of the way that the session is laid out. So I'm going to give a little bit of context in terms of what we're talking about. And then we're going to jump in. You've already jumped in, hopefully, to pause your video and answer some of those questions in the worksheet to do a little introspection. But this is essentially what we're going to be doing. So you're going to be using that worksheet a lot. And, I also mentioned grabbing that the slide deck as well, so you can kind of follow along with both of those to make it easier for you. I typically ask folks to think at this point about adding their specialty or essentially how they identify after their name. It is good to kind of just keep that in mind as we move through the session because that personal identity, if we think about, like I mentioned a little bit about my past and a little bit about my title now, that shifts over time potentially. And so that's a little bit about this session, the pieces that do shift as opposed to the pieces that stay constant. These are the things that we're actually going to work on. And these objectives really talk about reflection and clarity, not output or branding. Like I said, this isn't necessarily an output related, artifact related session. But this is about kind of getting the language and awareness, for internal direction setting and also future conversations. So if I'm thinking about whether that be in a particular job sector, academic, creative, whatever it is that you're in, it's beginning to be able to talk about yourself in terms of your priorities. So I'm going to come back to that opening reflection. Um, you hopefully paused and took a few minutes to write down some ideas, but if you didn't do that, I think it's important to do it, so this session really builds from this inward reflection. And then if you're working when we're doing this together, then you actually have an opportunity to work with other people. But we're not going. You're going to simulate that interaction on your own, essentially. But basically, if we're thinking about like this is a synthesis process, so we will work together on this internal piece, and then you'll have a little bit of an opportunity to, to do a little bit more reflection. And so if I think about, there are no right answers, so take a few more minutes if you've already jotted something down to take a look at that, and then, think about what you notice about yourself. And, just take a couple minutes, pause, and do that. Right. And then we're going back to the overview. And yeah, so, part of it, you might be thinking like, why should I care about this? Why does it matter? And I mean, part of it is, identity work, um, can be very important when we think about, some of the things that may have shifted for you when, kind of the norms, the specialties, the titles, the positions, all the things kind of drop away, fall away. Um, those different affiliations, because this is about this idea of, you're not reinventing yourself, but you're kind of reorienting potentially, and also maybe recognizing kind of what your values are and how they may be transferable to other places. And obviously, that has to do with other components, like if we think about just practicing resilience, right? Because there's a lot of pieces within shifting your identity or kind of feeling like you're losing your professional identity that relates to that. So I want to shift us over to starting a little bit more deeply, if we think about this idea of reflection. So to think a little bit about, some of the components of really who you are, what makes up you, in terms of that identity. And so, here, because you don't necessarily have a timeline, you could choose to answer all of the prompts. But I would invite you for right now to just pause and maybe answer two or three of them, and to just, take a few minutes, maybe, let's say, at least, I would say at least 8 minutes to answer two or three of these, for yourself, right? Because this is an introspective piece. So pause, and we'll shift back to the next piece. There's no break unless you want to take one. This is from the live session. And so if I'm thinking about, you don't necessarily get an opportunity to talk with someone in a pair share. Um, But what I think might be helpful for you to do is to think a little bit about what you wrote, and to think about, and make a note for this for yourself, so you could think about it and then pause and write it down on your worksheet, right? So what are the things that you actually see in terms of patterns in reflection? What are the values that kind of come up for you? And, are there any things that you might infer based on that in terms of like continuity and your sense of purpose, who you are, and how you walk through the world? So I would just invite you to pause and take, just take, uh, 5 minutes or so to, to actually see, what it is that you're noticing. And then I'm going to shift you back to really think about this a little bit more in depth with some of these uh, specific ways of examining it. Maybe you've already done this yourself when you had, a few minutes to reflect on this. But, if I'm thinking about pausing, right? Going back to the worksheet, and then, these types of question stems and opportunities to kind of like delve a little bit deeper, they actually help you kind of transition from like what I consider to be like Yeah, it's like raw ideas, right? So like brainstorming to actually shift more into this idea of synthesis. And it might be something that you come back and revisit even in the future again, because when we take a step away from things, sometimes we also have more clarity. So I would take about 10 minutes for this activity. Again, pause the video, go ahead and do that. And remember, that your answers right now, if they feel like they're really simple, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Maybe you need to sleep on it. Maybe you need to step away and come back. Like I said, that can actually be really, really helpful. This can just be like a grounding exercise, like an initial piece for you. Okay, so now you've had an opportunity to do some reflecting. I'd like you to think a little bit about um, yourself and how you talk to other people. So if we're thinking about this is a draft, right? Um, so, if I think about, I gave a little bit of ways in which you might think about starting this off. But this is like a brief working version, right? So you're going to pause the video, you're going to take an opportunity to fill out the worksheet. And remember, this is your first draft, not your final draft, right? It's not polished, right? So, but this is basically like a way to think of yourself as like, an evolving articulation of who you are maybe becoming professionally, particularly if you've had to shift where you've been before. So I would invite you to take at least 10 minutes to work on this. I mean, it may seem like too much time, but obviously you're on your own. You can take as much time as you want. You could take less time, you could take more time. But I would invite you to pause the video and go off and do that. And then if we're looking at this is the point in the session where I typically ask folks to share in the chat, but you could actually write this on your worksheet. Um, what is a sentence from your narrative that you were just working on, that draft? And then what would be a value or a strength that feels especially true for you right now? So I would invite you to pause and then go back and take a look at your worksheet and write down some ideas. This is the end of session one in the career series. Unfortunately, if you don't join the actual session, you don't get all the other pieces, which is the Q&A and the chat and the discussion and all those other things. So I would really encourage you, if you can, to come to the sessions. If if we're looking at the live sessions. Um, some of the things we talk about in those live sessions, I think, are also beneficial for you to go back to on the worksheet, so like what's still on your mind, what stood out for you today, what might your next step be, right? Because this is actually the worksheet gives you the context, the activities give you and have given you an opportunity to think a little bit about this topic. Um, and then, if I'm thinking about the other thing that I usually ask folks to share are things that they might want to carry forward or something they've discovered about themselves that they don't want to forget. So I would also pause and fill this out on the worksheet because everything that we do in these sessions is actually for you. So I would take a few minutes to actually fill this information out for yourself. And yeah, keep in mind as you visit the worksheet, you know, looking ahead, there are ways in which this narrative can be utilized. So I think it's really important to take the time to go through the worksheet, to take all the time you need to feel like you've constructed a narrative about who you are becoming as opposed to potentially like the professional identity that you've had to shift from. And I also think it's really important to take really good care of yourself in this process because it's not easy to have a shifting identity. Um, it can be a little bit like a death to lose your professional identity. And so we think about all the different ways in which we experience trauma. This can be another one. So I do think, you got to think about ways to take care of yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, while you're doing that work. But, part of it is this narrative can be very useful for you when you're decision making, but also in your communications with other people. And I just want to come back to remembering that this session is about introspection, right? So if I'm thinking about like your core values, those typically stay true. And if your sense of purpose is one that connects with your values and overlaps, and also connects to the greater good, in terms of helping other people in some way, that usually helps in terms of your long-term aspirations and feeling really true to yourself as well. So I thank you so much for being here today. I invite you to go back to that worksheet post session to take a look at what you've created, to work on this personal narrative, and then, yeah, make some sort of a plan for yourself to revisit this. I do think it's good to step away and come back. I thank you for being here today. I look forward to seeing you in the next session. If I don't see you personally, I hope you at least take the time to interact in this mode.